Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the vault on what has to be one of history's greatest, most baffling true crime mysteries. We are diving deep into a royal disappearance that quite literally changed the course of England forever.
Okay, just imagine this chilling scenario for a second. What if two young princes vanished into thin air from one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the entire country, and no one, I mean literally no one, ever saw them again? It sounds exactly like the plot of a premium Hollywood thriller, right? But this is actually a very real, incredibly dark chapter of history. And honestly, it's wild that more than 5 centuries later, historians are still actively trying to untangle the truth behind this mind-boggling event. So let's get right into part one, the ultimate royal disappearance in a 500-year-old mystery. Moving along to section two, we're looking at the Wars of the Roses and the state of England in the late 15th century. Now, to really make sense of this whole mystery, you absolutely have to understand the incredibly high stakes surrounding the crown at this exact moment in time. The Wars of the Roses, well, it wasn't just a mild political disagreement. It was this prolonged period of intense political tension, brutal civil war, and incredibly violent conflict over the English succession. The climate was dangerous. It was completely cutthroat. The royal family was navigating this world where losing a bid for power didn't just mean, stepping down from office. It usually meant death. And that brings us to the year 1483, where this rapid, totally chaotic chain of events really kicked off our mystery. It all starts when King Edward IV unexpectedly dies. Suddenly, boom, his 12-year-old son inherits the throne, becoming King Edward V. Shortly after that, the new, very young king is joined by his younger brother, Richard, the Duke of York. But because the king is only 12 years old, his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, steps in to become Lord Protector. Let's just pause on that specific title for a second. A Lord Protector held a temporary but immensely powerful role. Uncle Richard was legally appointed to govern and protect the realm on behalf of his young nephew until the boy actually came of age. This gave him absolute, unquestioned authority over the children, over their household, and really over the entire country itself. Which leads us to section 3, inside the fortress, the infamous Tower of London. So, under the guidance of their Lord Protector, the boys were relocated to the Tower of London to await the upcoming coronation. Now, today, we usually think of the Tower as this dark, dreary prison, right? But at the time, it was actually a functioning royal residence. It was a place of total luxury where a soon-to-be king would traditionally and very comfortably prepare for his crowning. But, and this is a big but, we can't forget that it was also a heavily guarded fortress. It was an incredibly secure, basically inescapable stronghold. The boys were placed inside a structure built to keep enemies out, sure, but it was just as effective at keeping people securely locked inside. At first, though, there was absolutely no reason to panic. The English public eagerly awaited young King Edward V's coronation. The entire country was gearing up for this massive, joyous royal celebration. Daily life inside the tower proceeded totally normally, and the gears of the monarchy seemed to be turning exactly as they should. But then we hit section 4, the illegitimate heirs, and a sudden shift in power. Suddenly, everything flips. The political maneuvering gets incredibly dark and highly strategic. Out of nowhere, Parliament passes a document called the Titulus Regius. This was a formal act of Parliament that officially declared King Edward IV's children completely illegitimate. Just like that. In one swift legal move, the boys were entirely stripped of their right to the throne, instantly invalidating the grand coronation that the public had been so eagerly waiting for. So with the boys legally delegitimized, the path to the crown was just blown wide open. Uncle Richard ascends the throne, crowning himself King Richard III. The very man tasked with protecting the young king had successfully taken absolute power for himself. So what actually happened to the boys in the tower? Well, at first, there were eyewitness accounts of the princes playing freely in the tower grounds. But as time goes on, their appearances become less and less frequent. Then they began fading from public view completely. Finally, the gates just close on their story entirely, and dark, terrifying rumors of murder begin to spread like wildfire across England. The shock of this royal disappearance literally shook the nation to its very core. All right, section 5, prime suspects and motives, the ultimate whodunit of 1483. Historians have been obsessing over this for centuries, so let's neutrally examine 3 major figures who constantly find themselves at the center of this historical investigation, along with their proposed motives. First up, Richard III. His motive is often cited as a desperate need to eliminate rival claimants to secure his highly contested rule. Makes sense, right? Next, we have Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. His proposed motive revolves around creating chaos behind the scenes to gain immense political power for himself. And finally, Henry Tudor. His motive would be to secure a totally uncontested throne for an entirely new dynasty. Now, we're not taking sides here. The real beauty of this explainer is just looking at how the historical evidence presents such compelling and very different potential motives for each of these men. Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, an unsolved historical mystery that ended up changing England forever. Look, regardless of who you personally suspect, there is one undeniable truth you should take away from this explainer today. This single, unsolved event forever altered the course of English history. It effectively closed the book on one dynasty and set the stage for the turbulent years to come. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower changed England forever. Now, it's really easy to point the finger at the man who took the throne. But if Richard III wasn't responsible, then who was? It's a cliffhanger that has haunted history for over 500 years. I highly recommend diving deeper into the source material to explore the evidence for yourself. That is all for today's explainer. I hope we've helped bring this 15th century cold case to life for you. Keep analyzing, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time. Welcome in, everyone. Today, we are opening up a 500-year-old cold case file to investigate one of the most chilling and honestly consequential disappearances in all of human history: the lost princes in the Tower. As our historical sources note, for more than 500 years, historians have argued over one haunting question: what really happened to the princes in the Tower? So before we start pointing fingers, let's briefly set the stage. Picture this. We have two young royal boys who enter the imposing, heavily guarded walls of the Tower of London. And remember, at the time, this wasn't just a prison. It was a functioning royal residence. They were actually supposed to be there, awaiting a coronation. But then, the absolute unthinkable happens. The princes vanished without a trace inside the fortress. No bodies were recovered, no public announcements made, absolutely no funerals held. Just an eerie, sudden silence that would literally echo through the centuries. Section 1. Prime Suspect, Richard III. All right, let's dive right into this investigation by looking at the traditional narrative that's totally dominated history. You see, every good cold case needs a prosecution. And against Richard III, well, that prosecution was massive. For centuries, the accepted history relied heavily on Thomas More. He wrote what was basically considered the definitive account, laying the blame squarely and brutally at Richard's feet. And then William Shakespeare comes along, takes that account, and amplifies it on the stage. He delivered this truly villainous portrayal of Richard III, cementing his image as the scheming, murderous uncle for pretty much everyone. Together, they built this giant cultural case against him that seemed totally bulletproof. But here's where we start finding some huge cracks in the case. When you compare those widely accepted Tudor accounts with the deep doubts of modern historians acting as the defense, a completely different picture emerges. Modern historians are asking us to really look at the source material. I mean, think about it. Thomas More and Shakespeare weren't exactly writing in a vacuum, right? They were writing under the Tudor dynasty, the exact same regime that overthrew Richard III. So we have to ask ourselves, is this traditional narrative an objective fact, or is it just heavily biased reporting designed to make a new king look good? And that realization is a real game changer. If we can't completely trust the primary prosecution, well, we have to look elsewhere. We have to ask the terrifying question, but what if someone else had a motive? Which brings us to Section 2, Alternative Theories and Suspects. This completely opens up our suspect board to some major players. Let's take a look at who else is on this board. First up, we've got Henry VIII. After taking the throne, his hold on power was incredibly fragile. That gives him a massive motive, eliminating any legitimate rivals who could threaten his brand new crown. And the princes, they were the ultimate threat. Next, there's the Duke of Buckingham. The guy was a master of political scheming. Orchestrating a high-profile murder in the chaos of that era could have been a ruthless, calculated play for his own personal gain. And finally, we have the survival theory, which is just thrilling. This idea posits that one, or maybe even both princes secretly escaped the Tower. It flips the whole narrative upside down, basically saying the reason there were no bodies is simply because, well, there was no murder. But listen, motives are just theories. To figure out what actually happened, we need to step away from all the political whispers and look at the actual forensic evidence. What does the physical evidence at the crime scene say? Section 3. The 1674 skeletons. Let's see how a shocking discovery made nearly 2 centuries later completely reshaped things.
Okay, flash forward to 1674. Workmen are digging beneath a staircase in the Tower of London, and they unearth 2 children's skeletons. Because of where they were found and the apparent age of the bones, everyone immediately assumed, wow, these are the lost princes. So, following this discovery, the skeletons were actually treated as royalty and reburied with immense honor in Westminster Abbey. But an assumption isn't proof, right? Moving into the 20th century, scientists tried to examine the bones, but they were severely hindered by the limitations of the time. They just didn't have the tech. Which brings us to today, where there are ongoing requests for advanced DNA testing to finally unlock the truth.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that despite the initial discovery, the Grand Westminster Reburial, and all those modern DNA requests, no definitive identification has yet to be made. We still do not have a conclusive scientific answer about who is actually buried under those stairs. And if the physical evidence is staying silent, we're forced to look back at the historical record. But this time, we need to ask a slightly different question. Who controlled the narrative? Section 4, Tudor Propaganda and Myth. We always have to remember that history is written by the victors, and in this case, those victors were unequivocally the Tudors. The Tudors didn't just win the throne, they won the story. For them, shaping public opinion was a matter of high-stakes political maneuvering. To legitimize their rule, their dynastic propaganda absolutely required a clear villain, and Richard III fit the bill perfectly. Over time, this state-sponsored messaging just kind of bled into popular historical myths, which were then immortalized through dramatic fictional portrayals like Shakespeare's. They artificially shaped public opinion so well that they managed to close the case in the minds of the public for hundreds of years. The myth literally just became the accepted history. Section 5. History's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. As we wrap up this investigation, let's pull all these threads together and see exactly where the consensus stands today. The reality is, historians remain completely divided. We're just laying out the facts impartially here, and the fact is, the evidence points in a dozen different directions. Whether it was Richard III, Henry VII, the Duke of Buckingham, or some daring midnight escape, there's just no absolute proof. And we aren't taking sides because the historical community itself cannot agree. Honestly, maybe that's exactly why this centuries-old mystery still captivates us so much. It invites all of us to become historical detectives, picking apart the propaganda, analyzing the motives, and listening to the silence of the stones. As the sources remind us, and I'll quote this exactly, whether the princes were murdered, escaped, or met another fate, their disappearance changed the history of England forever. More than 5 centuries later, the Tower of London still guards its greatest secret. Until new evidence emerges, the fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. So, I'll leave you with this one thought. If those bones in Westminster Abbey are finally tested tomorrow, and they don't belong to the princes, who else is buried under the stairs, and where did the real princes go? Keep questioning history, everyone.